ahead and get into things. All right, I think we're recording. I think I'm sharing the right screen. We'll go ahead and get started. So we are in the more on strategies and activities. We are going to kind of do a quick recap of some of the things that were covered in the 101 just to kind of get back into things. And then I wanted to talk about the My Strategy Bank today. That was one area that we weren't able to talk about at all when we did the 101 session. And then I have a couple of further examples that I think will be illustrative. And finally, we'll go ahead and get into some demonstration in the actual platform. All right, so let's do a quick recap here. And I wanted to bring up this graphic that came from NERN and MICIP. And they're really talking about that there's three things that really have to combine and able to have those socially significant outcomes. And when they're talking about, in our context, those socially significant outcomes would be whatever it is that we're trying to improve for our students. So that might be their improving their attendance, or improving their behavior, or improving their academic outcomes, right? So we could probably, without these things combining together, we could probably make slow progress. But if we want to make what they call those socially significant outcomes, that means those big gains that we're probably looking for in those areas, then we really need all three of these things. And so effective practice, that's really the kind of things that we're talking about today. Those are the strategies that we're putting in place, the strategies and the activities about how we put those in place. That's effective practice. And then effective implementation is making sure that we're putting it into the place the way that we should, and we're monitoring it and making adjustments. So we talked about that on the monitoring day. And then, of course, that enabling context. We spent a lot of time on the first day talking about teams, having the right processes in place, having the right data. And if you're missing one of those things, you probably won't get those significant outcomes that we're really hoping for. And I think that a lot of times, as we just kind of middle along and it doesn't seem like there's been a lot of change, it's because we're missing one or more of those pieces. And so just wanted to kind of situate where we are talking about strategies today. That's really this effective practice portion of the equation. You really need all three. You have to have effective practice. You need to be able to implement it well, and you need to have the right context. You have to be in a position for that to be successful. So that's through your team's processes, having the right data. So wanted to make a connection also all the way back to our challenge statements, which I think we talked about on day 2. We really start thinking about what we're going to do to address our goal areas all the way back when we do those challenge statements. So I kind of highlighted this a little bit. If you remember, the challenge statements are made up of 3 parts. There's an if, then, so, that. So in this case, this was the challenge statement that we were using kind of as a practice when we were making our practice goals. If staff have a better understanding of students' social emotional needs, then we can better engage the students so that social emotional indicators improve. You can kind of break that out when you're writing your challenge statements. If you think about kind of the why you're making those challenge statements, it's really trying to help you think through what are you going to use for your strategies and activities? How are you going to set your goal, or what's your goal going to be around? And then so that kind of become your outcome measures. So in this case, the if part is staff have a better understanding of students' social emotional needs. Well, that's probably what in this case, we would write our strategies and activities around. We would want to make strategies and activities around having our teachers have a better understanding of social emotional needs and why those things are important. So we would definitely write our strategies around that. The then portion is usually your goal. So in this case, we would be writing a student engagement goal. And then the so that are outcome measures. And so in this case, we would be writing our outcome measures around social emotional indicators. So that might be that their behavior improves, or their engagement in classroom is improved, or their days of suspension go down, things like that, right? So when you're making that challenge statement, it really starts to give you a hint about what you might want to write for your strategies and activities. So I have a little practice thing here. So I grabbed this from a district that I was working with recently, And this was the challenge statement that they wrote. So I'm going to give everybody a second to read that. So in this case, you can use the chat, or you could unmute if you wanted to. What would our goal likely be written around in this case? Okay, Billy's saying some sort of SEL goal. Yep, yep. Any other ideas? So the goal is out of that then spot, right? So it's this piece about students, families, and school community feeling valued. And so probably some sort of SEL, some sort of climate and culture goal. Thank you, Christy. Right. So it's something that and maybe even an engagement goal, trying to get them engaged there. So our goal would probably be written around that. So then what about our outcome measures? What might be looking at in this case to see if what we're putting into place worked? Improved attendance, yep, and SEL outcomes, attendance data, student achievement data, yep. So right, we're looking at that, so that spot, right? So that students will come to school and their achievement will increase. So all those pieces. And then of course, that last piece, what will we need to do to meet the goal? So what might be some strategy and activities that we might put in place? Looking at that if statement, what might some of those strategies and activities that might be thinking about? Okay, so I'm seeing some family engagement activities, improved school to home communication. Yep. Community building, family focused. Right. So basically what we're doing is when you write those challenge statements, I wanted to kind of make a connection back to a little bit earlier in the process. That's the first time that you're really starting to think about this. And the challenge statements can really kind of help you to think if you're on the right track for the different parts of that you might be working on. So anyway, just kind of wanted to make that connection with that and with the NERN CISEP piece. So just a quick reminder, a lot of times when I'm working with folks on this, and sometimes even when I'm trying to work on it myself, figuring out the difference between a strategy and an activity can be a little bit challenging. And a lot of times somebody will say, okay, I think we should do this. And it's like, well, that's really more of an activity. And so it can actually get you bogged down a little bit. So I like to kind of look back at the definition for this. So the strategy is really that roadmap to achieving the goal, and it includes the specific actions that the adults will take, including what they'll do, who will do it, and what that action will be, and what the fidelity will look like. So the strategies are the main thing here. It's those specific things that the adults are going to do. And strategies can be very specific, and they can also be written more broadly. I always remind people that if you're writing real specific strategies, you might end up with a lot of them. And for every strategy that you put in place, you're going to want to be monitoring it. And so we're going to be talking about that today. So it can be, if you're writing lots of real specific strategies, your plan can become pretty overwhelming to try to keep up with. And a lot of times we kind of start to not do it as much if we feel like we're behind, or it's like we can only focus on this one area. So like I've kind of tried to talk about throughout the whole series, definitely want to keep the amount of strategies that you're focusing on fairly low. So then what are the activities? The activities are really those actions that you're going to take to implement the strategy. So you might write some activities about getting ready or installing it. Might write some activities around how you're going to implement it, and you might write some activities around how you're going to monitor it. And I think, like we talked about at the last session, there are 4 different pieces to monitoring. One of the examples we're going to look at today really digs into this. You can monitor for the fidelity, capacity, scale, and the impact. So the activities really get into how you're going to put that strategy into place. So we're going to look at some examples of that. Hopefully by taking a look at some of the examples that can become a little bit more clear. Before I get into this, I wanted to see if anybody had any thoughts on or any good resources around the difference between strategies and activities. It always seems like I try to explain it, and I feel like I never do quite a good job explaining it the way that I should. And then and sometimes I'll even talk myself into a circle with it. So just wondering if anybody had any way that they've done that, if when they've been working with staff, or if they've heard somebody else kind of talk about it in a certain way that really resonated with them, or if there's any good resources that somebody has around that.
This is kind of my high school teacher brain. Strategy is what we're going to do, and the activity is how we're going to do it, including who's going to do it, who's going to receive whatever's being done, right? Like the staff is going to take the survey, but wait, back up, who's going to actually prepare the survey, who's going to send the survey to staff. So if like a staff or a family survey is the strategy, the activity needs to be the breakdown steps, almost like, I mean, I would explain this to high school kids, like think about the outline. We know where we're going, but now we need to know how we're getting there, who's driving and who's not backseat driving, etc.
Right. Yeah, so the what is the strategy, right? If I'm paraphrasing right, and then the how are the activities.
Yeah, and then the who gets kind of included in the activity piece.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you, Mary. Any other thoughts on that? All right. So I'm going to, I do have a little kind of sub dashboard for this. I'm going to pop that into the chat. So if you don't already have that open up, if you could open that. We are going to look through a few different documents here, and hopefully this helps to bring some clarity to some of the things that we've been doing. So if you came to my session last time, I did share these first 3 strategy implementation guides, activity planning tools, and strategy implementation monitoring plans. I'm going to go ahead and open those again and go over those real quickly, and then we'll get into a few other pieces. Excuse me. So the first one is your strategy implementation guide. And you're going to see the examples that I'm sharing don't look exactly like this, but they kind of get to the same outcome that this is. So this is really starting to think about what are the critical components to a strategy that we're going to be putting into place, and then what would it look like for us to put it into place. And that's kind of those first 3 columns, right? So like, what are the critical components? What would it look like, or what could it look like? And then there's a column here for what should it not look like also. I do see people kind of drop this field off sometimes. If they're doing something real specific, it's kind of nice to have it in there. If it's more general, sometimes you'll see this last one drop off because it's kind of like, well, this is what it looks like to put it into place. And they don't feel like they have to say the opposite of that. So I've seen it used in both cases. I've also seen it used where we identify what the gold standard is, and then after we try to use it, people come up, they kind of display the unacceptable variations. And so they kind of get the unacceptable variations emerge. Sometimes you can't think of what those are going to be until you try to put it into place. So if you've ever tried to build something from the ground up, you know what I'm talking about with that. So so basically what this does is you try to really think through what are all the different pieces of this, what would it really mean to put it into place. And especially if it's a research-based strategy, usually they're going to tell you these are the components that have to be in place for this. I think the example that we used was using the Healthy School Action Tool was an example that we used, and there were some specific components. There was meetings that had to be held at certain times and plans that had to be made, and different benchmarks that had to be followed. And so we turned those into the critical components. So anyway, I'm going to share some examples of this. Just want to refresh everybody's memory around these pieces. And these guides are not in MICIP. So like a lot of the other pieces that we've talked about, there's a lot of work that happens outside of MICIP. MICIP is really the spot that kind of guides you through the process and gives you a place to house a lot of your things. But the work all kind of happens outside of MICIP. And so this is one of those pieces. When you select your strategy, you really want to think through what are the critical components of that strategy? What is it going to look like to put it into place? The next one then gets into what kind of activities are we going to put into place? And like I mentioned on my previous slide, sometimes you're going to be starting a strategy from scratch and you need to think about what do we need to do to get ready? From our HSAT example that we used before, we needed to set up all of our meeting dates for the year, and we needed to get with the behavior consultant at the ISD to come in and help to facilitate some of the meetings, right? There was a lot of things we needed to do to get ready to do it. I think a lot of folks kind of jump straight into implementation, or maybe they skip getting ready and implementation and go right to monitoring. Don't skimp out on getting ready. And then what are you going to actually do to actually put it into place? So, what are those pieces? What's the PD that's going to need to be there? What materials do you need to buy? That goes into implementation. The monitor piece is how are you going to see that it's working? So you might put in there, we're going to give surveys to staff, or we're going to do walkthroughs with administrators and peer walkthroughs. So lots of things that kind of can go into the monitoring portion. And we talked about previously, this evaluation portion is something that's usually a little bit farther down the road, but maybe the good question here is what would it look like if that worked? You can kind of think back to your outcome measures and how you might evaluate those outcome measures. So this is a great document. It goes through what questions you should ask, and then it gives examples for each of those different areas. When I'm in MICIP and I'm either putting some of these in myself or I'm working with a district, I'll actually encourage them to put what kind of activity is it? Is it a getting ready activity? Is it an implementation activity, or is it a monitoring activity? I'll actually have them put that at the beginning of the activity. So getting ready, set up meetings for the year. Implementation, hold the meetings. Implementation, hold the PD, right? So I actually have them write that at the beginning of it. Or monitoring, do peer walkthroughs. So this is a great thing to really start to think through. Once you have your strategy established, what are the activities you're going to put into place? And then the last piece is what your monitoring plan is. And the way that this works is you actually take the critical component and the gold standards from your implementation guide, and you just literally copy those and you paste them into these first two spots. And then you think through, okay, how are we going to monitor this? Are we going to do walkthroughs? Are we going to give surveys? Are we going to monitor student data? What is it? How are we going to monitor this? Are we going to monitor how often the students are accessing the new computer program that we bought, for example, right? And then who's monitoring it? Who's being monitored? So in the example of, we're going to monitor how often the students access the new program we bought. The students are being monitored, and the teachers maybe can monitor that and then report it to the curriculum director or the principal. So anyway, this piece just kind of lets you helps you to think through all the different pieces of, for all those critical components, how are we going to really monitor that those are getting put into place? So when you look at all these documents and then start to think about, oh, now we have to gather that monitoring data. When you look at all these, it helps to kind of illustrate why the fewer goals you're able to establish, or more efficient amount of goals that you establish, and the fewer strategies you have into place, then you can actually stay on top of the monitoring of it. So I know I kind of harp on that a lot, but if you end up with 5 goals and with 5 strategies in each one, now you're at 25 things that you have to monitor. And each one of those strategies might have 3 or 4 critical components. So you're up to 75 to 100 things you're trying to monitor. It's just not possible. Even if you try to distribute that leadership, it's almost impossible to monitor 75 to 100 things in a school year. So you can see why kind of trying to back it off and try to think of what are those big systems goals, what are those really meaty strategies that we can get into. That's why we want to try to keep the amount of those things low, because we want to do a good job of the things that we're putting into place. And this is kind of the system for trying to do a good job with that. So before I get into the strategy bank and then get into some examples, I wanted to just pause for a minute to see if there are any questions that anybody had, or any pointers, or any examples or non-examples of any of the things that I've given so far.
One thing that we do along with the activity planning tool is the deconstructing the activity. So where they actually take, like we take each section, each of those 4 sections, break it up into little headers, and they lay it across the table, and then little note cards, and are actually going, manually kind of hands-on going through it, so they can really see and feel everything that's going into those getting ready or implementing section, and kind of play with it. Or, maybe somebody thought this was part of implementation. Nope, it needs to slide over to getting ready, or we're not, so there's just a lot of kind of hands-on, and then making sure that all the players are at the table and kind of having a chance to see that and think through it. So that's another good one to go along with that piece.
So that's awesome. I love that activity deconstruction. So could you maybe put an example activity or strategy that you did that with?
Yeah. I mean, you could do it with, any of the activities. So, gosh, I'm trying to think of the one. I'm working on one right now.
Not to put you on the spot, sorry.
You know what I can do is I can grab a slide from my slideshow, and I can throw it in the chat. So you can actually kind of see what it looks like.
Oh, that would be awesome.
I'll do that in a moment.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you. I'll keep my eye open for it, and we'll
Okay.
pop over and take a look at it once it gets in there.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Any other thoughts on that? Examples or non-examples, or anything that maybe you've tried or used in the past? All right, I'll go ahead and move on, and we'll talk about the My Strategy Bank, and then maybe after the Strategy Bank, we'll take a look at Billy's example that she's going to pop into chat. So I wanted to talk about the Strategy Bank a little bit. It's the only way that you can get strategies into MICIP, and there are a ton of strategies in there. They pulled a lot of them in from our national clearinghouses. A lot of our statewide organizations put strategies in there. So there's already a ton of strategies in there. And so likely what you're looking for may already be in there, or something that's pretty close to it. But I did want to show you what the actual back end of the strategy bank looks like, and talk about a little bit about how you can get your own strategies in. It seems that's a question that comes up a lot, is like, they're like, well, here's this thing that we do in our district, and I looked in the strategy bank and we couldn't find it. And Megan and I are actually going to be talking about that a little bit more when we talk about the college and career ready piece. So if this whets your appetite for the strategy bank and you want more of that, you can come to the next session that Megan's going to be leading. But I'm going to pull over. This is the My Strategy Bank, and it's just mystrategybank.org. So it's literally its own platform. And so a lot of times what people will do is they'll go to the strategy section of MICIP, and they're like, well, I just want to kind of add in my own strategy here. You cannot do that in MICIP. You have to add it in the My Strategy Bank. So I'm just going to kind of show you this a little bit, and then I'm going to go over a couple of resources about how you can get this to work. So this is the My Strategy Bank, and the main spot that you're going to come in here is to go to the strategy list. And from here, you can either create a strategy, or you can filter a strategy, which is basically how you search for them. And so in this case, I'm going to come in to filter this, and I'm going to look for career. And so this one here, this career related school record, this was one that Megan and I actually created. And so then you can pop this open, and you can kind of see what that strategy is all about. You can see that this was created at the Muskegon ISD. And then it just kind of goes through, and it kind of tells you about what the strategy is, and what the description is, and who it's for, and things like that. Links out to in this case, we had a strategy and activity template that we've created. So anyway, the strategy bank, this is where you make it. And so, and since we made this, I could edit it, but we're not gonna do that right now. But if you wanted to create a strategy, then you click create strategy. You give it a title and a description, and you'll see there's only a few things in here that have the red star on them. So while there's tons and tons of fields to fill out, there's not a lot that are actually required for you to fill out. The only two that are starred are the name of it and the owner location. And so if you are at an ISD like I am, then I could say, okay, I want this to be here for my entire ISD. And then I could just hit confirm selection. And now this strategy will be there for my whole ISD. If you're at a district, likely what you're going to do is it'll say your ISD, but when you click it, you'll only see your district. And then you could say, I want this for my whole district. Or you could say, I really only want this for my elementary schools, and you can click your schools. But that's how it kind of knows who can access it. So the thing that I think people are a little afraid of is if they put a strategy in here, now like, did I do it right? Everybody's going to see it and all this kind of stuff. When you make a strategy, it's only for the place that you said that it's going to go. So when I showed you that career strategy a minute ago, that's really only available for anybody that's in the Muskegon ISD. So when Megan and I made that strategy, it didn't go out and push out to the whole state. You have to have a different level of access to publish things into the state. So anybody can make a strategy about anything for their district or for their school, and they can put it in here, and it'll be just available for your district or your school or your ISD, depending on what your level is. So it's pretty easy to get them in there. The hard part is just getting access, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But it's not difficult to get that in there. I always try to put in as much information as I know. And I really like to put things in here about resources and the research. I think that it just kind of it gives some validity to the strategy when we're applying and we're trying to use those strategies to fund our state and federal funds. If there's good resources or good research around those, they're going to be more likely to get approved. So these are all, I try to fill out as much information in here as I can to kind of be as complete as I can with it. But as you fill out as much information as you have and you hit save, and then it will add it right to the strategy bank. So that's kind of how you get things into the strategy bank. And once you get them in, it's not an immediate turnaround in MICIP. So they say that there's at least a half hour for those two things to talk. I usually wait until the next day. So try not to make it a last minute thing if you need to add strategies. So I talked about that career strategy. I'm just going to show you in MICIP real quick where those things come up. So I'm logging into our actual ISD's MICIP right now, and I'm going to go to, let's see here, going to go over to our strategies. So if I had just added a strategy in the strategy bank and I tried to search for it, it would not show up. But that one that Megan and I added, we did that a couple of years ago. So I can come in here and search for career, and this career related school record is one of the activity, or one of the strategies that we added. So I can click on that, and you can see this was everything that I just showed over in the strategy bank. There's the title, the description, where it connects to the top 10 and 10 goals, and our strategy and activity template that we're going to show in our next session is linked here. So people can click on that. And then we also linked out to the actual legislation that said that that's a required piece to have in your continuous improvement plans. So that's kind of how it works. And only districts in our ISD would, if they search for careers, only districts in our ISD are going to be able to find this. I hope all that made sense. So the main point, let me recap real quick. if you are looking for a strategy or you have something real specific that was created that's just for your building or just for your district or just for your ISD, you're going to have to add it to the strategy bank if you can't find something that's close to it already in the bank. And so you'll need an account, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. And then it's not difficult to add them. You go ahead and you add the strategy, and then you have to have a short wait period. It's at least a half hour and up to a day. And then you're able to come in and just search in MICIP at the strategy spot, and you should be able to find that strategy. Hope that made sense. So I'm going to go back to our dashboard, and I have a whole bunch of links here under my strategy bank that kind of go through everything that we just talked about. So the first link takes you right to the logon page for the strategy bank. And you will, once you have an account, it will log on with, like for me, we have our whole platform is on Google. So I just log in with my normal ISD Google account, and it takes me right in. It's just like MICIP. It just it will take you in there. And then there's a whole document here that goes through the whole process for adding strategies. And it's really long, but it's just because they're going through every single step to talk about what each one of those different boxes means and all that kind of stuff. But this takes you through the entire process for how to add a strategy. This one is if you are an ISD user, you can create other users in your county. So for me, if somebody's like, hey, I want to add a strategy to the strategy bank, I can make them a user for their district. And then they're able to go in and add strategies. And it also has in here, if you want to become that super user, there's a process to do that, that you ask through the My Strategy Bank, and you can become that person for your ISD. So you'll need to find out if you want to add strategies and you're not in the strategy bank, you really need to find out who can add those. And so I have that under ISD leads. This is from last year. And when I looked at it, there are a few names that aren't correct on it, but hopefully it'll get you pointed in the right direction. I tried to find the new version of this, and I couldn't find the new version for this year. If I find that, I'll get it linked here. And then this account registration form, that's how to become to get that level of user that's usually somebody at your ISD would fill that out, and then they're able to give those to other people. All right, so that was kind of our crash course on the My Strategy Bank. We usually have a 1-hour session just on the My Strategy Bank, but the folks that work on that weren't able to be here today. So I thought I'd at least give a little crash course and share the resources. So Bernard asked, do you know if the goal is to have more evidence-based strategies? I did a search based on this filter, and only 35 academic strategies were evidence-based. So you use that filter strategy about the evidence-based, Bernard?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, well, because we were looking up for some strategies for some specific things working, supporting our districts. And so my superintendent's like, well, let's narrow it down by that. So we can do that, and only 35 and it's, when I did it, it was like over hundreds. So, and I know we're adding them as districts. So I didn't know, is the My Strategy Bank going to start pushing on us to actually put some evidence-based work into that process?
Yeah, so those, thanks for the question. They aren't, and I'm not an official rep of the Strategy Bank, so I'm going to do my best I can with the answer. But like I showed earlier, those are not required fields. And so I think we just kind of have to be good consumers of the information. And just because they don't list the evidence base for it doesn't mean that that evidence doesn't exist. So the way that they populated a lot of the Strategy Bank is they did some sort of pull feature where they pulled from a lot of clearinghouses. And I think that a lot of the fields just maybe didn't come over with them, or they didn't have them filled out in whatever clearinghouse that they pulled them over from. And I know that a lot of the ones, especially the ones that have been added by our statewide organizations like GELN and such, they've been working really hard to make sure that the evidence base is included in it. So I would say a couple of things. One, I'll say 3 things. One is if if the evidence base isn't listed, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just might not have pulled over from whatever way it was put in. If it wasn't manually put in by somebody that was trying to do a really good job to fill all the fields, it just might not have gotten in there. So that'd be one thing that I would say.
No, I appreciate that feedback.
Yeah,
'Cause
yeah.
I was just a little taken aback of, well, there's only 35. That's
Right.
like, what are we doing? Right. No, so I
Yes.
appreciate how they did, if they did mass pull, it makes sense that they may not.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing that I would think is I think the good thing is if I go in and just add something to the strategy bank and I just add Dave's best strategy ever, that doesn't go out to the whole state. That's just going to be for what I assign it to. So there's not a bunch of junk just getting tossed in by everybody. It might be, but it's only going to be available to them. Right. So yeah, I think those would be a couple of things that I would think about. And mostly that it just might not have pulled over. So it might be a little extra step to kind of look for that. I know whenever I add a strategy, I do try to put some evidence in there so that people can feel confident about that. All right. I wanted to talk about one last thing. And sorry, this is kind of a specific piece, but if you are creating a strategy, if you don't do one specific thing, it will not show up in MICIP no matter what you do. And that is, let's see here, got to find the right spot. Description, use rates. Oh my gosh, you guys, types. Yes, okay. Whew, for a minute, I thought I wasn't gonna be able to find it. Down here under types, and this is not a required field. So if you skip this field, it will not show up in MICIP. So under types, there's several listed here. The only ones that are going to show up in MICIP is if you click improvement. So the strategy bank feeds other systems. And so for example, it feeds MyRead or MyLearn. I can't remember what it's called. It feeds that. And so if you put in an improvement strategy, it's not going to show up in MyLearn. If you put in an instructional strategy, it's not going to show up in MICIP. So you might have something that is a community strategy, and that's awesome. Or it's an instructional strategy and you want to put it in there. But if you do, it's not going to show up in MICIP. So this is the one super important thing I wanted to mention before I move on. Sorry, it's a real detailed piece, but it will not show up in MICIP if it's not there. So make sure that you click improvement. That is also called out specifically in that how to create a strategy one, but make sure you have improvement clicked. I've tried to add them before where I put, oh, this is an instructional strategy, and I clicked instructional and it'll never show up in MICIP. So that's my last hot tip on that one. All right. Any other questions about my strategy bank? And then we're going to take a quick peek at Billy's example that she shared, and then look at a couple of other quick examples around some strategy details.
David, am I correct that if we play around in the My Strategy Bank, we can't really break anything, right?
Right. Yeah, you're not going to delete somebody else's strategy that has been put in there and stuff like that. So yeah, I would feel pretty good about getting in there and messing around and looking at things.
Okay. I'm a very hands-on learner, and I remember somebody at MDE at one point said they approve a lot of things, and I wasn't sure though if that had changed. I'm like, I don't want to ruin your stuff by looking at it.
Yeah, I think you're probably okay at this point to get in and look around, try creating a strategy, all those different things. I think you should be good with that.
Awesome, thanks.
You got it. All right, so I think I'm still sharing my screen. Is everybody seeing the example that Billy had put in there?
Yep, that's up there.
All right, perfect. Go ahead, Billy.
So I grabbed this because it was quick and handy for me. So this is an example we went through with the district a couple of years ago. So yeah, so it's outdated, but we're going through it again in next month. So this district was looking at some different climate and culture goals. They ended up breaking it down to 3, picking one of these 3 strategies. I can't remember now what exactly they went with, but so one of these was, or their goal, I'm sorry, this was their goal area. And then they were going to go with a strategy. So let's just say they picked PBIS, right? This was while they were still kind of working through what they were going to do. So if they went with PBIS as their strategy, then the activity that we were looking at the next slide is really deconstructing. Okay, we want to do PBIS, then what do we have to do? How are we going to get ready? Now we've changed the language to installation. But what pieces down here have to happen so that we are ready? And then what do we think needs to happen for implementation, for monitoring, for evaluating? So really all of those colored note cards are going to demonstrate a different activity that goes with implementing the strategy of PBIS.
You're singing my tune. So basically then you can translate this activity right into MICIP, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. And like I mentioned earlier, MICIP doesn't have a way to differentiate that this is a getting ready activity or an implementation activity. And so it's like I would always say, of all those blue cards should say getting ready at the beginning and then say what your activity is, because otherwise it's just gonna, it can get all jumbled up in there. So but yes, this is wonderful. This is a great thank you for this like really practical view of what that looks like.
Sure.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Anything else you wanted to add about that?
No, pretty straightforward, but I definitely think powerful, you know,
Yes.
when they actually go through it.
Yep. Yeah, it doesn't have to be like mind-bendingly difficult. I mean, sometimes those, you know, the simple processes to be able to look at it is going to give you those quickest results. So appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, I have just a couple of examples that I want to share. We have about 8 minutes. And the first one that I wanted to share was an example from the FAME project. And they did some work with the Michigan Assessment Consortium. And they really wanted to dig into the strategy of formative assessment. And so they have this really nice definition that they made about formative assessment. And on the second page, it said, it had these guiding questions. Where are we going? What does the student now understand? And then how do we get to the learning target? And then out of those guiding questions, there were specific components. So where are we going had a planning component and a learning target, and each one of those had some subparts, right? And then what does the student now understand had this eliciting evidence of student understanding. And then how do we get to learning target had 2 spots, formative feedback and instructional learning decisions. So you can see that if you want to select formative assessment as a strategy, which I have quite a few districts that do, there's a lot that goes into it. And so what you might want to do is, as you're going to see here on the strategy guide, it's enormous. And so if you're going to do this, you might say, hey, we're going to really focus on where are we going this year? And then you're just going to have to monitor around maybe 4 things. If you try to say we're doing formative assessment and you just jump whole hog into it in 1 year, you're going to get bogged down because you have like 12 different things that you're supposed to be looking at. So I wanted to look at their strategy implementation guide because this was a real practical example of using that template that I had shared earlier. And so for them, they kind of modified it a little bit and put it into 3 parts: the critical component, the gold standard that came straight off of that strategy implementation guide, and then they put progression of stages. So they tried to give some practical examples about what that might look like at 4 different stages. And then you can see that it goes into great detail here about each one of those. And so you can see here, this whole section is about that guiding question about where are we going? And here's the first component. And here's that first element of that first component. So that ties all back here. Where are we going? The first component was planning, and the first part of planning was instructional planning. And so if I look at, if I look at their piece here, that's how it all lays out here, right? And so then it goes into really good detail about how to do that. So the Michigan Assessment Consortium and their work with FAME is top notch. And when you look at it though, it just cues you to know that some of the stuff that we're trying to put into place is really complex and it takes time to put into place. This is why we're writing 3 to 5 year goals. And we're not trying to just do formative assessment. There's a lot of learning that we have to do about this. We have to get ready for this stuff, and scoping that all out on your strategy guide is really important. And then following through on a process like what Billy just shared, if you just said, hey, we're really going to focus on component 1 this year, that's when you get your cards out and you start laying it out. What do we need to do to get ready to do this? How are we going to implement it? What are we going to do to monitor it? So just kind of slowing down, really thinking about if you wanted to do, in this case, formative assessment, how are you going to break that down into its component parts and scope that out over multiple years to work on? So I just thought this was a really good example, wanted to share that. And I wanted to share an example of something we're actually doing at the Muskegon ISD. And we just completed the strategic planning process. We ended up with 6 different strategic plan areas. And then each department at our ISD set goals around those different strategic plan areas. And so I wanted to just kind of show what this looks like, so you can kind of see a different take on this whole process. So our ISD goal was to help educators collaborate on initiatives that benefit students and staff. And so then our department, I'm in the instructional services and special education department. Our department said that in order to meet that goal, we wanted to develop a system that uses data to inform decisions about district needs around training and coaching. And so one of the areas that I'm specifically working on is number 3, which is our MAISD service delivery process. And so that is the strategy that we're putting into place. And then we wrote out some activities for that. And then we thought through, how are we going to monitor this? And so we broke the monitoring out into fidelity, scale, capacity, and impact, just like it is in MICIP. And we actually use this to collect all the feedback from everybody in the department on this too. So that's kind of where we laid out our goal. And then we made a strategy implementation guide for that. And we just kind of broke it into 2 pieces. We said, what was the critical component for this? And then what's the gold standard? What would that look like if it was put into place? And we have a lot of like processes and visuals and things like that written around that we kind of laid out here. And then we made a monitoring tool so that we could actually track the monitoring on it. And so the last time we monitored this was in February. And so we just took the activities and we posed them as questions, and then we were able to come in and talk about, and we monitored it and documented all of our monitoring for it. So it's just wanted to show kind of that practical example about how to put it in place, and to show that you can modify the different resources that we've talked about to kind of fit what works for your implementation. So an ISD is a little bit different than an LEA in the way that we implement things. The MICIP plans look different. And so we took those same concepts and modified them to fit our purposes. Okay, so we kind of ran out of time for the MICIP demo. Luckily, we did demo this whole process at the last session. So if you wanted to see how that worked, you can check out the video from session 3. We went through and we kind of demoed this whole process, and so you're able to look there. But I would have liked to have gotten in there and take a look at that, but I think we had some really good examples that we wanted to share today and a couple of good questions. So we do have 1 minute. So I wanted to pause and just see if there's any final thoughts or final questions that anybody had before we go ahead and end this first breakout.
This was really helpful. Thank you. I love the dashboard upon dashboard. Honestly, they're really helpful.
Good. Well, hopefully you can dig and find them all.
Often.
All right. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and we'll close up this breakout, and I'll see everybody back in the room, and we'll talk about our next round of breakouts. Really appreciate everybody being here. Thank you.